Good evening, ladies. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. What I'm going to be discussing with you is the 7 habits of highly effective people, which is a topic that I've been practicing and reading over as part of my personal leadership course. So the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People is a book written by Stephen Covey, and it basically goes over 7 different habits that we can practice as personal or professional individuals, but it helps us be more effective, really think about things in a different way and experience paradigm shifts that allow us to be highly effective. So, as I mentioned, there are 7. We won't be going through all 7 this evening, but I am going to just briefly show you and get into just a quick overview, if you will, of the 6 habits that lead into the 7th. So we've got habits 1, 2, and 3, which are listed right here at the bottom. Once you've achieved these 3, you have now achieved the private victory, and you've moved from dependence to independence. Once you've reached this level, you then move on to habits 4, 5, and 6. And once you've achieved habits 4, 5, and 6, you have now achieved the public victory, in which you are moving from independence to interdependence. As you will notice, there is then this circle that runs around the 6 habits, and that's habit number 7, which is sharpen the saw. That's the habit that I will be discussing with you this evening, because it was one that really stood out to me, that helps us really focus on ourselves and investing in ourselves. So, as I mentioned, habit 7 is sharpen the saw, which is the habit of renewal. And when we think of renewal, we look at it in a couple of different ways. There are 4 dimensions which we will be going over, but this idea of renewal is important because when we think of life and everything in our lives, whether it's electronics, our cars, ourselves, there's this idea that everything breaks down if it's not taken care of, if it's not maintained, and if it's not, as I said, renewed. And so when we think of that, we sometimes forget to think of ourselves. So when we think of ourselves, there are 4 dimensions or aspects of ourselves that we have to renew regularly. And if you look over at this graphic, we've got 4 dimensions, and I will go through each of them, but there's the physical, the mental, the spiritual, and the social and emotional. So with the physical is just that. It's the investment and renewal in the body. This can encompass a variety of different activities, but it's the ones that we think of but perhaps don't always do, which is exercising, getting a full night's rest, managing our stress in an effective way, and eating healthy. So perhaps eating healthy or considering a dietary change, but really investing in our bodies. We then have the mental dimension, and the mental dimension is just that again, pretty self-explanatory. It's the mind. And so with the mind, there are various ways that we can challenge and renew ourselves. We could continue our education and pick up an additional hobby, or take on something that really challenges our mind, crossword puzzles, reading, studying, picking up a new language maybe. So there's a lot of things that we can do from a mental standpoint to really keep our minds fresh and sharp. And so it's really important that we invest in our minds, especially as we get older. We want to make sure that we are keeping our minds fresh, because at the end of the day, if we aren't keeping our minds fresh, as Dr. Covey says, we probably won't last very long. So as we move on over to the spiritual one is the one that really stays close and vital to who we are as human beings. But specifically, it's personal because it's really who we are as myself or as yourself. So when we think of our personal mission statements, are you familiar with the personal mission statement?
Yes.
Perfect. So when you think of the personal mission statement, this is what the spiritual one is, the one that really stands close because it is core to who you are, and what your beliefs and values are that you hold true to yourself. So with the spiritual one, that can encompass things like community service and outreach, reading inspiring literature and quotes, perhaps meditating or taking time to appreciate nature. There's a lot of activities that we can do around the spiritual aspect, but things that make our soul feel really great. And then finally, we have the social and emotional. So the social and emotional is really just making sure that we're taking time to invest in our key relationships. When I say invest in our key relationships, I'm referring to the emotional bank account. The emotional bank account, essentially, it's obviously not a real bank account, but it's an emotional one that involves us taking the time to invest through actions, words, just different things that we do with our key relationships and those that are closest and most important to us in our lives. And really making sure that we make those high deposits. So when times perhaps either get tough, when we're faced with hard moments, we really have people that we can synergize with, that we can talk to, that we can depend on to really spend time in that social and emotional area. One thing to take away from this is that while these activities may not necessarily seem urgent, they are very important. And so there are 4 quadrants of importance. The big takeaway for this is that a lot of these all actually fall into quadrant 2, which are, as I mentioned, activities that aren't necessarily urgent in our lives, but they are important. One thing to also consider when we think of the 4 dimensions is that there are assumptions or thoughts that we can possibly take away so that we are deciding how we want to, what kind of paradigm we want to use when we're thinking of these 4 dimensions. So what legacy do we want to leave behind? If I was told that I had experienced a heart attack and that I needed to make a change, what does that change look like? And so we just really want to make sure that we are thinking of ways to approach these dimensions and really maximizing our time in them. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Any questions?
Of the 4 dimensions, which would you say is the most important to renew?
So that's a great question. There isn't necessarily one that's more important to renew than the other, because as I mentioned, everything breaks down at one point. So if you're only focusing on 1 or 2 out of the 4, then something's going to break down in the others. So it's highly important that you take the time to renew regularly in all 4 of these dimensions and really identify ways daily and weekly to be able to invest in these areas so that we're not necessarily losing or breaking down one more than the other. Any other questions? Oh, perfect. Okay. So finally, what I just want to make sure that we kind of look over is the paradigms that we experience when we consider habit 7 and sharpening your saw. So there are ineffective paradigms and effective paradigms. The ineffective way of looking at this would be only looking at what the outcome or production is. So are you familiar with the story of the goose and the golden egg?
Yes. Yes.
Perfect. So when we think of the goose and the golden egg, if we're only focused on the golden eggs, then at some point the goose is going to break down. So the highly effective way of looking at this idea of sharpening your saw and renewing is nurturing that goose that provides the golden eggs so that the golden eggs continue to come. And as I mentioned, while you practice this habit consistently, there are a lot of positive things that can come from it. So it can improve your capacity, you can really experience continuous improvement, and your relationships can be stronger. So what I would really suggest in this habit and how to approach the behaviors for this habit would be to really, as I mentioned, take time to experience these regularly, renew regularly within the 4 dimensions, and when you do experience hardship in any of these 4 dimensions, be strong in those situations so that you don't experience a breakdown in any of them. So, any questions?
No.
Perfect. So as I mentioned, again, The Habits of Highly Effective People, 7 Habits. It's a fantastic book. A lot of great takeaways here, so I really would suggest checking it out when you get a chance. Thank you so much, ladies. I appreciate your time.